Thank you. Thank you very much, Marlene, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me here. I think it's a great forum. As you pointed out, a lot of my work does touch upon European integration. Actually, what I'll be presenting here doesn't so much at all. So I think it's really much more geared towards your kind of political culture crowd. So I'm also very interested in hearing what you have to say about it. Just a little bit of background before I launch into the project itself. It's been a 4-year project funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, in which I investigate the title of the talk, which is How Conceptions of Democracy Shape Citizens' Tolerance for Democratic Backsliding. I'm currently working on the book manuscript. It is under contract with OUP, and I have promised to submit the final manuscript in February. So different chapters are at different stages. I'm going to kind of present mainly from the theory, the measurement, and then an experimental chapter. And yeah, look forward to your feedback afterwards. I'll start my little timer here so that I don't go vastly over time. But the lead question is really this puzzle of why citizens tolerate democratic backsliding. And the assumption in principle would be that citizens in particular, and reasonably consolidated democracies, as many of the post-communist democracies now are, should be the final safeguard, the final bulwark against the undue expansion of executive powers, simply by voting these people out of office before democratic backsliding becomes entrenched to the point where elections are no longer a meaningful way of changing governance in a country. So that's the main puzzle and the main question that I try to address. And of course, not the only person that has found this puzzling and sought to explain this kind of behavior. But I would say the probably most prominent explanation that is out there in the literature is very much focused on partisan dynamics, partisan polarization, and this idea that citizens, while being well aware that democratic violations are occurring, will be willing to trade these off against their partisan loyalty, will be partisans first, and will engage in democratic hypocrisy, as Simonovitz and co-authors say, in basically deciding quite consciously to overlook violations in favor of having their own guy or girl, mostly guys, in office in these countries. Another explanation focuses more on the value trade-offs. So here it's not so much about the partisan loyalty, but the idea that, again, citizens in principle recognize what is going on, recognize that there are violations of democratic standards, but will prefer or give priority to economic or cultural orientations by candidates, often cultural conservatism or simply very instrumental buyouts that they're promised in exchange for their votes. And so, again, trade off democratic preferences against something else. And then the third potential explanation, this is what I bring to the table, is that it's actually not that citizens see and recognize and punish a democratic backsliding, but that they're actually pretty divergent understandings of democracy, even among citizens in reasonably consolidated democratic systems. And that it's precisely this lack of consolidation around liberal democratic norms among citizens that explains why, ultimately, when it comes to elections, we do not see a turnover in favor of a more democratic candidate. So this argument is grounded, of course, in very much the political culture literature that your group focuses on. Both the long-standing seminal studies, this idea widespread support for democracy really is key to stability and also consolidation, with recent contributions confirming this time and again, including also Marlene's work. But also this idea that there's really a linkage between aggregate level support for democracy and regime type. And that, I mean, Engelhardt and Welzl give this a kind of a cultural or regional spin that I don't so much engage with. But really this idea that if there is sufficient support for democracy in a country, then we shouldn't see these kind of democratic breakdowns. And then the reverse would equally be true. It opens a kind of line for our vulnerability. And then there's a third set of literature that I'm interested in, and this is really the literature that often zooms into individual countries or a limited number of countries to show that there's actually a persistence of relatively different understandings of democracy, even among the given population. So when we say there's high support for liberal democracy in the world or in a given country, that actually masks a lot of heterogeneity when we dig a little bit deeper and look into what individual citizens understand when they say, yes, I support democracy, and this is actually rather different. And so specifically the question that I tackle is that a lot of this literature on alternative understandings of democracy basically shows this in a descriptive fashion, so builds typologies and shows that there is this diversity, but doesn't so much look at the political consequences of these diverse attitudes. And I really try to link at the individual level diverse democratic attitudes, diverse understandings of democracy, and political behavior in the face of democratic backsliding. And that's really the big idea in the book. And they develop a theoretical argument that proceeds in 3 stages. I'll focus primarily on the first and on the third during my talk today. On the demand side, first of all, I expect commitment to liberal democratic norms to remain relatively uneven among citizens, so that a rather substantial part of the electorate still is vulnerable to trade-offs, but also to really direct appeals to non-liberal understandings of democracy, be they majoritarian, illiberal, even authoritarian to a certain extent. I then have a chapter where I also acknowledge that, of course, there's a supply side to the story. There are political elites that try to shape what citizens think about democracy. And I show that they deliberately appeal to these alternative understandings and say, you know, democracy is not about all of these liberal norms, but it's about ensuring better living standards, or it's about ensuring stability for the country, avoiding the chaos of multi-party governance, all of these things. And then in the third part, and that's the experimental part that I'll turn to in this talk, I link this supply and demand, and I argue that democratic backsliding occurs and then also persists because citizens don't vote these actors out of office when we have these non-liberal attitudes among the population, and they coincide with an authoritarian leader arriving in office and deciding to exploit this vulnerability to consolidate their grip on power. Now, there are many ways in which scholars before me have tried to measure liberal democracy, and the fact that we have these large cross-national surveys also has allowed for a large number of empirical studies to probe these early conceptual takes on the relevance of political culture. And I argue that there are broadly 3 ways in which democracy is thought to be measured. The first is kind of the Churchill way. So while it may have problems, democracy is the better system. And so each time respondents are asked to respond to this. There's a second very common question in these cross-national surveys, simply the importance of living in a democracy. So Ferry and Creasy use this question, but then also point out that because put in these terms, citizens are going to say, of course, you know, I understand the social cue, the social desirability of saying it is important to me. So they actually advise to dichotomize between 10 out of 10 and anything below. So anything like 9 out of 10 would already be not strongly supportive of democracy. And then, for instance, in the European Social Survey, we have a battery of liberal items that's put to citizens, and they're then asked to agree or agree less with the importance of these different items. One flaw, one limitation that all of these approaches share is that there's often very little cross-national variation, despite the fact that we have high levels of variation in the quality of democracy. And so that has been phrased as a kind of paradox, that we allegedly have this extremely high support, and yet we don't really see this translated into consistent outcomes. So what I propose as a measurement is actually a more composite measure of understandings of democracy that assesses not just support for liberal items, which is kind of easy to give in the absence of an alternative, but assesses the relative commitment to liberal democracy alongside other potential understandings. And then I bring this together into kind of one composite measure of democratic commitment. The cases I look at are, Marlene mentioned it, I'm particularly interested in these post-communist countries, Poland, Hungary being the most prominent cases of democratic backsliding in Europe, but also being, of course, very prominent cases for the alternative explanations that are out there. So we know both when it comes to partisan polarization, it's extremely high in both cases, but also when it comes to deliberate trade-offs, we have a very strongly national conservative government in both cases, and a strong desire not to get rid of this, or kind of, or at least a strong voters being strongly tied to these partisan platforms. And we have both of these leaders, Orban and Kaczynski, engaging in very explicit trade-offs, targeted benefits for their voters to keep their support. Now, the way I measure these different understandings of democracy, I kind of define 4 ideotypical understandings, which I don't expect individuals to adhere to exclusively, but I really expect understandings of democracy. I measure them as being a composition of these different understandings. So the first is a very classical liberal emphasis on equal rights, executive constraints. So what we would typically measure in an ESS battery. I also have a number of items that seek to capture egalitarian or instrumental understanding. So here the idea of really being more focused on outcomes, on democracy as a system that delivers public goods, and not so much only about the procedural side of things. Then a majoritarian understanding. This is something that has been highlighted by scholars as being relevant for democratic backsliding in the United States. Really the kind of an excessive understanding of majority rule as being that any decision supported by the political majority, the elected majority, is democratic per se. I also have one chapter that I won't dwell on here, but on focus groups, and it's quite striking just how explicitly many participants will say that for them that is democracy. Democracy is whatever the elected government wants to do. Because it's elected, it's legitimate. And then the final understanding here, drawing on these authoritarian notions of democracy from Welzel and colleagues, the idea that actually democracy is not so much about free choice, participation, and everything at all, but kind of a misguided understanding that strong leadership, clear rules, citizen obedience are what really counts. And so Welzel and his colleagues call that either democracy misunderstood or democracy confused. And so I let respondents rate these 12 items that you can see here. So 3 items per understanding. And the question is basically the World Value Survey question. Democracy means many different things to many people. To what extent do you think it is essential for democracy for basically these items to be fulfilled? With the understanding that in particular for the majoritarian and the authoritarian items, so the authoritarian items I rephrased from the World Value Survey terminology, and the majoritarian items I created myself. The formulations are quite stark, so that if you adhere to that, then it's really a strong sign that you're not fully committed to a liberal democratic understanding. So if we say here for the majoritarian understanding, the minority must accept the will of the majority in all circumstances. So really the idea was to have a pretty high benchmark for people to adhere to that. And then for the authoritarian understanding, the government limits civic freedoms to rule efficiently. Again, if this is something that you rate, say, above 2 or 3, I find that rather problematic when it comes to your commitment to liberal democracy. And then I use a latent profile analysis to bring together these 4 measurements at the individual level and to build what will turn out to be what I'll present now, 5 different groups of understandings in both countries. And what was very interesting for me to see, and in a way comforting, the same groups come out for all 5 countries. And if you have a larger or a smaller group of countries, the only thing that becomes more or less differentiated is kind of the middle, the somewhat undecided ones. And what's quite stark is the strong liberals here. So they have a very high commitment to the liberal items. They also have a reasonably high interest support for the egalitarian items, which I don't find theoretically as problematic, because you can support procedures on the one side and outcomes on the other. There's no direct contradiction. Whereas with the majoritarian and the authoritarian items, they do speak quite directly to procedures. So being high on one of those, in addition to the liberal item, I would see as something that is not a sign of clear commitment. So here we have the strong liberals, and they exist for both countries. We see very clear clustering for the liberal dimension in particular. So that's really what's driving also the sorting of these different latent profiles. There's a second group you can already see just from the amount of dots. It's way larger than the strong liberals. These are what I qualify as weak liberals. So they also score very highly on the liberal dimension, relatively highly also on the egalitarian. But what's different compared to the strong liberals is that they also have pretty high support, around 4.5 on average, for the majoritarian dimension. So really this understanding that, sure, equal rights, minority rights are fine, but a majority rule and a relatively unconstrained majority rule is also very important. Then there's a third category that I qualified as the ambivalent Democrats. Another way of putting them, they're the kind of the high level indifference. So everything is important. Liberal democracy is important, but so are all the others, including, as you can see, also the authoritarian. So we have no one here in either of the 2 countries scoring low on the authoritarian dimension. Obviously rather problematic to have a similar level of approval for all 4 of these different dimensions. And then we have the true indifference, and these are not the speeders, because I removed those from the sample. These are just people who say, you know, you give me 12 items about democracy. I think they're pretty average level. I agree 4 to 5 to each of them. Again, we see this very clear clustering for the liberal dimension that's significantly lower than for the previous 3 groups. And we see some more noise for the other three, but overall this is, in particular for Poland, a very, very large share of the population that simply don't seem to have a very clear understanding of what democracy means to them. And then there's a final group, here you see it's relatively small, but we do have outright authoritarians that score very low on the liberal dimension, about 3 on average, and 3 is really the maximum for most respondents in this group, and then score highest on the authoritarian dimension, although there, of course, there's also a bit of spread. And so I use these understandings later to basically plug them into a subgroup analysis of the experimental findings that I'll turn to next. Just here to provide a little overview of the distribution. For Hungary, we see that the weak liberals are in the clear majority, so they're around 57% of the sample. For Poland, and I don't actually know what is more concerning, it's the indifferent one. So it's really, and you see this also mirrored in the focus groups, there's a sense that it's hard to say anymore what democracy really is or should be, or how it's working, and there's a lot of confusion and a lot of disillusionment. There's disillusionment also in the Hungarian case, but in Poland I find it almost more striking in the focus group transcripts. So moving to the experimental dimension, the idea was then to say, okay, so if we bring together undemocratic positions by candidates, so the supply side, with these different understandings of democracy on the part of respondents, how does this play out in terms of their choice between 2 competing candidates? And I reanalyzed some data from 2 separate papers that I wrote with different co-authors that you can see here. The one is a candidate conjoint in Poland, the other one is in Hungary. In both cases, we have 2 democratic attributes. In Poland, it's 2 violations. In Hungary, it's 1 violation and 1 kind of broader priority, understanding of what democracy is, that the candidate expresses. We also have a cultural orientation for each of the candidates. We have an economic orientation. In the Polish case, I also have partisanship. In the Hungarian case, we didn't choose to include partisanship because we were more interested in other dimensions, so we can speak a little bit differently to the 2. And both profiles contain age and gender, so their candidate choice conjoint experiments were that I basically used to probe 2 hypotheses, or the first is a set of hypotheses. The democratic commitment hypothesis, so what I'm actually most interested in, of course, in the book, the idea that both sides of the coin being the more strongly and exclusively respondents are committed to liberal democracy, the more strongly they will reward liberal positions. And then on the other hand, the more strongly they will punish democratic violations. So basically for this to go in both directions. And then I also pick up on the partisan dimension that's been very prominent in the literature by formulating an incumbency hypothesis as a rival hypothesis, where the expectation is that it actually doesn't have so much to do with what respondents understand by democracy, but that is a question of those supporting the incumbent party that will be less likely to punish non-liberal democratic positions than the supporters of opposition parties. So there's simply a question of is your guy, girl in office, and if so, then they're allowed to violate democracy as long as they're kind of serving other of your interests. And the idea here was then in both of these conjoints to really capture these diverse understandings of democracy in the different levels for the democratic violations. So for Poland, as I said, we had 2 outright violations, one regarding judicial appointments and the other being the role of the public media. And here the differences are relatively subtle, so I'll just make it clear for one example. For the judicial appointments, the liberal understanding would be that judges should be selected based on cross-party consensus. For the majoritarian one, they should be selected by the government, so something that does happen in certain countries, the US being one of them, but that is still, of course, less clearly about division of powers and minority taking account of minority interests. And then what we qualify as an authoritarian interest, that the idea that the judges should be selected by the leader of the ruling party. And so, as I say, the differences are relatively subtle, but when we look at the conjoint results, that's something that respondents understood quite well. For Hungary, we also have a similar item for judicial independence. And then we have this, as I said, broader item of a democratic priority, because here it was about choosing between 2 prospective leaders. And here the liberal view, we let the leader say that their view was the government should ensure equal rights for all citizens. A more instrumental egalitarian view that the government should improve living conditions for all citizens. and then a majoritarian view that the government should implement the will of the majority, full stop. So not saying what the implications thereof might be, but again, we see a pretty clear ordering effect at the aggregate level. Turning to the results in Poland, here we see that, as I say, there is a very clear difference. For you have the first two are the democratic items. Overall, at the aggregate levels, a strong reward for liberal positions, majoritarian positions at the intermediate position being somewhat neutral, and then a punishment for the authoritarian position. Same for public media. We also see a pretty clear divide, and it's quite interesting, on abortion. So this was a highly salient issue when we ran the survey, because there was an additional restriction introduced here. On average, respondents prefer a liberal regulation of abortion in favor of women's rights, and not this very restrictive view that was introduced then by the PiS government. Here, as I said, in the Polish conjoint, we also have partisanship, and so we can look where the shared partisanship plays a role. It plays a very important role. And yet, when we look in a moment into the different partisan subgroups, that's not what comes out as being most important when it comes to the violation of democracy. And tax reform also matters. So basically what we can say at the aggregate level is everything is important to voters. And then the question really becomes, depending on how strongly they're committed to liberal democracy, how does this then differ? And here we see the results for the subgroups here on the side of the different understandings of democracy, strong liberals, weak liberals, and so on. And here we really see a clear ordering effect. We see that for the independent judges, there was a very strong, very clear, also a significant difference, estimated difference for judges that have liberal votes, and then it really it goes down based on relative commitment to liberal democracy. There's also, unlike for most of the other groups, a significant rejection of a majoritarian view here among those that are the strong liberals, and then all of the other groups are relatively undecided here. The punishment is less clear on the authoritarian side, so it's but which may also be due to the fact that this item is formulated in a less stark way. We didn't want to make it too blunt to also avoid social desirability driving the results rather than something else. And then when it comes to media, we also see we basically have two groups. So we have the strong liberals and the weak liberals that strongly reward liberal positions and strongly punish authoritarian ones. And then the other three groups that are together elsewhere. And we also see that the strong liberals, and then somewhat ironically, the authoritarians are the ones that are strongest in their support for liberal abortion rights and rejection of restrictive abortion rights. I dig a little bit deeper in the measurement chapter on who are these authoritarians, and it turns out that they're actually overwhelmingly young and female and well-educated. So that one conclusion is that they're actually disillusioned Democrats. When you look back at the items that we use to measure authoritarianism, so one of the elements here there is to say elections only serve to elect the government. You can actually support that, or you can feel that this is what's happening in your country and thus support it, and thus end up in terms of measurement in this authoritarian group. So there's a bit of an uncertainty where that is concerned. Now, as I said, when we look into the significance of these findings of the estimated difference, they are significant. So this is always comparing the strong liberals to one of the other groups. There's no major surprise here. Just with this for the media, free media, there's no significant difference between weak and strong liberals, but otherwise it goes in the expected direction, and also the expected size of the difference for the different effects. There's really quite a clear ordering for the different groups. Now, there was also the alternative hypothesis that was that this is basically a question of partisanship. And here for Poland, we do find a bit of an indication thereof. Although, once again, Poland was the country where we were also measuring partisanship separately. So you could also get your party person and the violation, although they don't happen to be the incumbents. But here we do see that PiS supporters are the ones clearly being less critical of non-liberal positions, less rewarding of liberal positions, and less critical of authoritarian positions for both of the items. And they're also all alone with even the Confederation, so the far-right party being on the other side. They're also, and in this case, they're together with Confederation, they're the ones that view liberal views of abortion rights negatively and restrictive views positively. So we also have some cultural difference at the party level. Overall, though, the effect size, if I just quickly skip back to the difference here for the different understandings of democracy, is way bigger here than it is for the partisan groups, where the distance between the different estimations for the conjoint tasks is smaller. Turning to Hungary, for the aggregate pattern, there's one thing that's interesting. So we have this very, very clear ordering, even clearer than we did for the judges in Poland. Liberal items on average, liberal levels strongly supported, majoritarian ones more neutral, authoritarian ones strongly rejected. It's much less clear for this broader item that we formulated on democratic priorities. So here we actually see that on average, citizens prefer an egalitarian view, so an emphasis on improving living conditions, over the liberal emphasis on equal rights for all. And we also see that when majoritarian becomes the harshest, the least democratic version, and there's no authoritarian item, then it's actually punished on average by everyone. And here in Hungary, economic items didn't play a big role, but cultural items did. So here we have a strong punishment on average of an openness towards new influences, and then a positive effect of seeking to promote or even protect traditional culture against outside influences. Now, looking in the Hungarian side into what the effect is of the different understandings of democracy, for the democratic priority, also somewhat in line with the fact that there wasn't a massive difference between the liberal and the egalitarian, we don't see any significant difference in the understandings based on the strong liberals. So the assumption here is that maybe it was too general. So a bit like when you ask for, do you support democracy? It's hard for people to say yes, no, and there's also only a small effect. But we do have even more than in the Polish case, this very clear ordering from strong liberals to weak liberals, to ambivalent, to indifferent, to authoritarian when it comes to the level of punishment. So very much in line with hypothesis 1A, and then here with hypothesis 1B, also this difference when it comes to the punishment. When we look at the estimated differences, we see that these are in line also with the overall subgroup patterns. There are significant differences for the judges items, but not consistently for the overall for this democratic priority item. So this seemed to be something that captured differences in understandings less well, both for the partisan groups and both for the understandings of democracy, but also when it comes to partisanship. So it seems that simply the attribute we chose there was a bit too removed or too general to really generate significant differences between respondents. Last point here for Hungary, when we look at the partisan subgroups, what's interesting here when it comes to the incumbent hypothesis, although we didn't have an explicit partisanship in the conjoint, we don't have any effect. So we don't see that Fidesz, for instance, would be more willing or not significantly more willing. So they are somewhat closer here to the middle, but there's no significant differences here when it comes to their willingness to tolerate violations of liberal democracy or the reward thereof, and also on the other side to be open towards this majoritarian view or the authoritarian view. Where we do have a massive difference, though, similar to what we saw before for peace and confederation, is when it comes to this cultural orientation. So Fidesz voters are going to be very, very negatively predisposed towards a leader that proposes openness to new influences, and very much in favor and really far removed from all of the other parties, including Jobbik, for a leader who wants to protect traditional culture against external influences. So it really seems that this partisan dimension plays out at the level of cultural polarization more than really divergent understandings of democracy or the willingness. So kind of some voters simply to being less democratic than others based on their partisanship. It's really more a question here of cultural differences and of cultural conservatism. So to wrap up, what I show in the book is that there is actually considerable heterogeneity once you do get to measuring this a little bit in a little bit more nuanced way in the way citizens understand democracy, and also overall in both countries that I look at, a lack of liberal democratic commitment. Democratic violations in line with my expectations are punished more consistently the more exclusively respondents are committed to liberal democratic norms, and the reverse, the more they're committed to liberal norms, the more willing they are to reward liberal positions by candidates. For the partisan patterns, it's much more mixed, so we don't have strong support for the incumbent hypothesis that I formulated, and the divides appear to be more strongly driven by the cultural dimension. So that overall, what I aim to show with the book is that political culture that has been sometimes a bit rapidly cast away as a potential explanation of democratic backsliding due to its long-standing and structural nature actually informs political behavior in these contexts of democratic backsliding by virtue of the relative strength of citizens' commitment to liberal democracy. Thanks a lot, and I look forward to your questions and comments.